They laughed at his boots for months. Cracked leather, worn soles, military lacing that belonged to a different era, the kind of boots a man wears when he's forgotten who he used to be. Logan Pierce mopped marble floors and said nothing, smiled at nobody, went home to his daughter and cooked whatever was cheapest at the grocery store. But on the night the building lost all power and a retired 4-star general lay bleeding on the executive floor, those same laughing executives went completely silent. Because the man they mocked didn't panic, didn't freeze, didn't reach for his phone. He moved. And the general looked up at him and said 2 words that changed everything. If this story hits you, drop a like and comment your city below. I want to see how far this one travels. The elevator doors opened at 6:47 in the morning, and Logan Pierce stepped out onto the 32nd floor carrying a gray mop bucket with a busted wheel that dragged and screeched against the marble every 3rd rotation. He'd reported the wheel to facilities 3 times. Nobody fixed it. He stopped reporting it after that. He parked the bucket beside the east corridor, wrung out the mop, and started at the far end near the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over downtown. The city was still half asleep at that hour. A pale orange light stretched along the skyline, the kind that made the glass towers look almost warm. Logan didn't spend much time looking at it. He had 4,200 square feet of polished stone to clean before the first wave of employees arrived at 8, and the marble on this floor had a way of showing every scuff and every heel mark and every careless coffee spill from the night before. He worked methodically, the way he did everything, overlapping strokes. No wasted motion, steady pace. His shoulders were broad under the gray uniform shirt, the kind of build that came from years of physical work and not from any gym. His face was lean, angular, the jaw carrying a couple of days of dark stubble because he'd been too tired the past 2 mornings to bother shaving. He was 32 years old and looked, depending on the light, either his age or 5 years older. The boots were what most people noticed first, if they noticed him at all. Heavy black leather with military-style lacing, reinforced toe caps, the kind of boots you didn't buy at a department store. They were old, visibly worn along the outer soles, and they made a particular sound on the marble, solid, deliberate, that was different from the soft-soled shoes most office workers wore. A few of the facilities guys had asked him about them early on, curious. Logan had told them they were comfortable and left it at that. Most people in this building did not ask him anything. The 32nd floor belonged to Nexarian Group's executive division. It was where the senior vice presidents kept their offices, where the boardroom with the $12,000 chairs sat behind frosted glass doors, where a small fleet of executive assistants maintained the kind of controlled, pressurized quiet that signaled importance. The floor had a different smell from the rest of the building, some combination of expensive wood polish and whatever air freshener the facilities manager had selected to convey professionalism. Logan had noticed it on his first day and stopped noticing it by his 2nd week. He'd been at Nexarion for 7 months. Before that, he'd done maintenance at a warehouse complex out near the port for 11 months. Before that, 6 months of nothing much that he didn't like to think about. The Nexarion job paid better, had health coverage that covered Emma, and the commute was manageable. Those were the 3 things that mattered. Emma was 8 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and Logan's stubborn streak, which she expressed primarily through her opinions about what constituted an acceptable dinner. She was in 3rd grade at Harmon Elementary and had recently developed a serious interest in building things out of cardboard, so their apartment had begun to accumulate a collection of structures that were somewhere between architectural model and abstract sculpture, depending on how you looked at it. Logan had stopped throwing them away after she'd caught him doing it once and explained, with extraordinary calm, exactly why he was wrong to do that. He'd agreed with her. He still thought the one that was supposed to be a spaceship looked more like a sad mailbox, but he kept that to himself. The mop bucket wheel screeched as he rounded the corner toward the south side of the floor, and he winced slightly at the sound in the early morning quiet. A security guard named Terrence, who worked the overnight into morning shift, looked up from the reception desk at the end of the corridor and gave a short nod. Logan nodded back. Terrence was one of maybe 4 people in the building who acknowledged him with any consistency. The others were Carmen from the 2nd floor cafe, Marcus from loading dock, and occasionally a young data analyst named Priya, who had once asked him if he knew where the lost and found was. He did not count the executives on 32 among those 4 chats. The first time Harlan Voss made a comment about the boots, Logan had been working at Nexarian for about 6 weeks. Voss was a senior vice president of strategic partnerships, which was a title that seemed to give him the impression he was entitled to conduct himself like a minor deity. He was 47, broad in a different way from Logan, soft across the middle, thick through the neck. And he wore suits that cost more than Logan made in a month. He had the particular manner of a man who had spent his entire career being the smartest person in whatever room he decided he was in, even when he demonstrably was not. Logan had been replacing a burned-out bulb in one of the corridor light fixtures. It was a task that fell under his responsibilities on 32. When Voss walked past with 2 other executives and stopped. "What is that?" Voss said. Logan looked down from the stepladder. "Bulb replacement." "Not the bulb. Those." Voss was looking at his boots. The 2 men with him, both in their 40s, both wearing the cautious smiles of people who had learned to laugh at Voss's jokes without quite joining in, turned to look as well. "Boots," Logan said. "Where'd you get them? A war museum?" The 2 men made sounds that weren't quite laughs. Logan climbed down from the stepladder, folded it under his arm, and picked up his kit. "I'll get the hallway by the boardroom next," he said. He walked away. Behind him, he heard Voss say to the other 2, "I don't think he understands the question," and the hallway carried the sound of real laughter this time. Logan kept walking. He didn't tell anyone about it. It wasn't the kind of thing you told people unless you wanted to make it bigger, and making it bigger served no purpose he could identify. He went home that evening, made pasta with a jarred sauce that Emma had strong opinions about. She thought it needed more garlic, and she was probably right. Helped her with subtraction homework, and didn't think much about Harlan Voss. But the comments continued. Not always from Voss. The 32nd floor had its own social ecosystem, the way any enclosed professional environment does, and somewhere along the line it had become mildly acceptable to make remarks about the janitor with the strange boots. A few of the junior executives picked it up. There was a woman named Stacy Drummond, an associate director of something Logan never fully tracked, who had a habit of making comments just loudly enough to be heard when Logan was within earshot. Things about whether he'd gotten dressed in the dark. Things about whether facilities had a dress code for its staff. Logan cleaned their floors. He replaced their light bulbs. He mopped up a coffee spill outside the boardroom that Voss made without breaking stride and without acknowledging that he'd made it. He said good morning when people passed him in the corridor, and when they didn't respond, he didn't take it personally, or he worked hard not to. He was good at working hard not to take things personally. He'd had practice. The thing about Nexarian that you understood quickly, if you paid attention, and Logan paid attention to most things without appearing to, was that it was a company in the middle of a transformation it wasn't entirely comfortable with. Nexarian Group had been built in the mid-90s as a defense and logistics contractor, the kind of company that did government supply chain work and secure transportation and a handful of things that weren't on the company's public-facing website. About a decade ago, under different leadership, it had begun diversifying into commercial enterprise services, security consulting for corporations, risk management, private infrastructure. The transition had been profitable, but culturally messy. The company's old guard, mostly former military and government types who had been there since the beginning, had retired out or been pushed aside. In their place came a new generation of business school MBAs and corporate strategists who understood markets and not much else. Then 3 years ago, the board had appointed Avery Sinclair as CEO. She was 30 years old at the time of her appointment, which had generated considerable news coverage and considerable skepticism from within the company. She came from a background in corporate restructuring. She'd been brought in as a turnaround consultant at 2 separate firms before Nexarian recruited her, and she had a reputation for being precise, unsentimental, and effective. Logan knew all of this because Terrence had told him most of it, and because Logan had a habit of reading things carefully. He'd read Avery Sinclair's profile in the business press in the break room one day when someone had left a magazine on the table. She'd come up through a difficult path, raised by a single mother in a mid-tier city, scholarships through school, first job at a consulting firm where she'd apparently outworked everyone around her until they couldn't reasonably not promote her. There was something in the profile about her being precise to the point of coldness, about how she didn't spend time on things she deemed unproductive. He'd folded the magazine and gone back to work. He'd seen her a handful of times in person. She was medium height, dark-haired, always in motion. The kind of person whose stillness, when it happened, felt deliberate, like she'd chosen to pause rather than simply stopped moving. She dressed in a way that was expensive without being showy, and she had a manner that most people read as intimidating because she didn't waste words or expressions on things she didn't mean. Logan read it differently. He thought she was just efficient. She'd probably learned early that inefficiency was something other people got to afford. She had not, as far as Logan was aware, ever registered his existence, which was fine, which was normal. He cleaned the floor outside her office 3 mornings a week. She had walked past him, either before or after being in her office, probably a dozen times in 7 months. Not once had she looked at him directly. Not once had she said anything. He was a function of the building's maintenance to her, the same as the ventilation system or the cleaning schedule posted on the inside of the supply closet. He understood that completely. He did not hold it against her. Thursday mornings on 32 were usually quieter than the rest of the week. Something about the rhythm of executive schedules meant fewer early arrivals, fewer back-to-back meetings in the corridors, fewer coffee orders and print jobs, and small administrative crises in the first 2 hours. Logan usually had the south wing to himself until well past 8. It was a Thursday when he first had an actual conversation with Avery Sinclair. He was waxing the corridor outside the boardroom, using the floor buffer on a low setting because the marble near the boardroom entrance tended to scuff from the foot traffic of people who'd been conditioned to shuffle their chairs dramatically when making a point in meetings. He had his earbuds in. He listened to things while he worked, sometimes podcasts, sometimes audiobooks, sometimes nothing, and he'd just forgotten to take them out. He was listening to nothing when Avery Sinclair came out of her office and walked toward the boardroom and then stopped. Not because of him. She'd stopped to look at something on her phone, the way people did when they were moving and then weren't. She was standing about 4 feet from where Logan was operating the buffer, and she was reading something that, from the way her expression shifted, a tightening around the eyes, a slight drawing inward at the corners of her mouth, was not good news. Logan reduced the buffer's speed and guided it to the far side of the corridor to give her room. She looked up from her phone. "Did you turn that down because of me?" she said. Her voice was direct, not unkind. "Didn't want it to be in your way," Logan said. She looked at him for a moment, not the way people in this building usually looked at him, through him or past him or in his direction while actually looking somewhere else. She looked at him properly, the way a person does when they're actually seeing another person. "I didn't realize I was standing in the middle of the hall," she said. "You weren't. Plenty of room." She looked at the buffer, then back at him. "How long does this floor take you?" "This section, about 40 minutes if the buffer's cooperating." "Does it usually not cooperate?" "The left wheel drags a little. Nothing serious." She nodded, and something in her expression suggested she was filing this information somewhere, in the same way she probably filed most information. Then she looked back at her phone, and the momentary opening closed, and she was already thinking about whatever had been on that screen again. "I'll get out of your way," she said, and walked to the boardroom. Logan turned the buffer back up. It wasn't a conversation, really. It was 40 seconds of 2 people occupying the same space without hostility, which, on the 32nd floor, was more than he usually got from anyone above a certain pay grade. He thought about it on the train home that evening, which surprised him a little. He thought there was something genuine in the way she'd looked at him. Not warm, exactly, but real, present. Like she'd actually been there in that corridor for 40 seconds rather than moving through it. Emma asked him at dinner why he was quiet, and he said he was just tired, and she accepted this with the pragmatic understanding of a child who had learned that adults sometimes just were. The annual corporate gala for Nexarion was held on the last Friday of March, and Logan had known about it for weeks because the preparations for it had constituted a significant portion of his recent workload. The event was held in the building's top 2 floors, 31 and 32, which were connected by a wide internal staircase that was normally kept closed and was opened for the occasion. The 32nd floor's boardroom and executive lounge were cleared and reconfigured. A catering company arrived 2 days before with equipment and staff. An events coordinator named Brielle, who was extraordinarily organized and spoke to Logan with the particular tired friendliness of someone who knew that the person with the mop was going to be their most reliable ally, had given him a detailed checklist of cleaning and setup tasks that started Monday and ran through the event itself on Friday night. Logan's role on Friday was set up from noon to 5, then a working shift during the event itself, monitoring bathrooms, responding to spills, managing the supply staging areas on both floors. It was a long day. He didn't mind long days especially. Emma would be at his neighbor Patrice's apartment, where she often stayed on Friday evenings, working on whatever her current cardboard engineering project was and eating Patrice's considerably better cooking. He put on the same uniform he always wore, clean, pressed because he pressed it the night before, boots laced the same way they always were. By the time guests began arriving at 6:30, the 32nd floor had been transformed in the way that money transforms things, efficiently and completely. The marble floors he spent his mornings mopping were now reflecting the warm light of several $1,000s worth of rental lighting. The caterers moved through the space with practiced ease. Servers in white jackets circulated with trays of things Logan didn't know the names of. The executives who had spent the week walking past him in work clothes were now in evening wear, and the change in clothing seemed to complete some internal transformation in them, like they'd been waiting all week to fully become the versions of themselves that belonged in this room. Harlan Voss was already loud by 7:15, his voice carrying above the polite ambient noise in the particular way of someone who wanted it to carry. Logan saw him from across the room and adjusted his path through the space accordingly. Not out of fear, there was nothing Voss could do to him that would feel like fear anymore, but because getting within earshot of the man served no purpose. The evening moved the way these events moved, speeches that were slightly too long, a moment when the caterers had a near crisis with a warming unit that Brielle handled with the contained ferocity of someone who had been through this before, clusters of people reforming and dispersing in the particular social choreography of corporate events, the power centers of each cluster easy to read from across the room if you knew what you were looking at. Logan knew what he was looking at. He moved through his tasks, monitored the service corridors, checked supplies, responded when Brielle's radio crackled with a request from the east bathroom. He was invisible in the way that service workers at events are invisible, not by hiding, but by performing a function so consistently and quietly that the room absorbs them. He was coming back from the supply corridor around 8:40 when he saw Avery Sinclair standing near the windows on the north wall with a glass of water. Not wine, he noticed, water, talking to an older man in a dark suit who moved with the contained precision of someone whose body hadn't entirely forgotten a long-ago discipline. The man was white-haired, mid-60s, and there was something about his posture and the way he held the room's periphery and his awareness, even while engaged in conversation, that Logan recognized from a different context. Logan identified him without needing an introduction. Retired General Raymond Holt. He'd been in the news cycle about 2 years back in relation to a Defense Appropriations Committee. Logan had read the coverage, as he read most things. He didn't think about the fact that he recognized the general. He registered it the way you register most things that don't immediately require action, and he moved on with his work. At 9:12, the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a momentary interruption. Full, immediate darkness, which meant it wasn't a circuit. It was something deeper in the building's power system. The backup lighting kicked in after 2 seconds, the kind of low-level emergency illumination that turns every large room into something between functional and unsettling, all shadows at wrong angles and faces stripped of color. The noise in the room shifted instantly. The warm, ambient sound of 200 people eating and drinking and talking became something more jagged. Voices sharpening, the clatter of things put down too quickly, the particular high-pitched tension of a crowd that doesn't know how alarmed to be. Logan was already moving before the backup lights fully stabilized. He pulled his radio, the facility's radio Brielle had given him, and keyed it. "This is Pierce on 32. Full power loss. What's your read from the control room?" Static. Then Brielle's voice. "Working on it. Something hit the main distribution panel. We're not sure what. Security's trying to reach the building systems team." "What's the status of the fire suppression system?" A pause. "Unknown. Get that confirmed before anything else. If suppression's been triggered without a fire, we've got a different problem." Another pause. "Copy that. He was already at the north wall, moving through the crowd with a sureness of direction that was different from how he'd moved all evening. Not running. Running in a crowd was a way to create secondary problems. But moving with a decisiveness that caused people to step aside without quite understanding why they were stepping aside. He saw two things simultaneously. A cluster of executives near the boardroom entrance who had the specific paralysis of people waiting for someone else to know what to do. And, near the windows where he'd last seen them, a disruption in the crowd's movement that suggested something had happened to General Holt. He went to the general first. Holt had gone down. Not collapsed. It wasn't a medical event, not exactly. But the sudden darkness had caused a surge of movement in the crowd near the windows. And in the press of bodies, the older man had been knocked off balance and gone down hard against the edge of a low display table. He was on one knee, one hand pressed to the side of his head, the other braced on the floor. The cut above his ear was bleeding. Avery Sinclair was crouched beside him, one hand on his arm, her voice steady as she told people to give him room. The people around her were not entirely giving him room because they were too busy looking at him. Logan knelt on the general's other side. "I've got you," he said. His voice was quiet, just for Holt, and it came out with an authority that had nothing performative in it. "Don't move your head yet. Look straight ahead." Holt looked at him. There was no fear in the old man's eyes. That was a quality you either had or you didn't, and Holt had it. But there was pain and the narrow focus of someone assessing their own situation. "I'm fine," Holt said. "You've got a cut. Probably needs pressure. You come down on your shoulder?" "Hip." "I'm fine." "Let me see your eyes." Logan looked at him directly, close range, in the dim backup lighting, pupils tracking, alert. "Okay, you're fine. Stay down for another minute." He reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out a folded cloth, clean, the kind he carried as a matter of habit, and pressed it gently to the cut above the general's ear. Then he looked up at Avery. She was looking at him. Not through him, not past him, looking directly at him with an expression he couldn't entirely parse. Surprise underneath something more composed, the way a controlled person lets something real show for just a moment before the composure reasserts itself. "I need two things," Logan said to her. "Someone who can get to the building's mechanical room on 14, not the secondary panel, the main room, and confirmation that the fire suppression on this floor hasn't been accidentally triggered." Avery blinked, recovered. "I can reach the head of building ops." "Do it now. The suppression system is the priority. If it activates without a fire, we have a carbon dioxide situation, and we need to get people to the stairwell." She was already on her phone. Logan turned back to the crowd near the boardroom. "I need everyone to move away from the windows and toward the center of the floor," he said, and his voice had enough carry to it that people turned. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. "Not urgently. Just give us some room. Building ops is handling the power. This is a routine precaution." Most of them moved. A few didn't. Harlan Voss didn't. "Who the hell is—" Voss started from somewhere to Logan's left. "Sir, if you could move back toward the center—" "I know who you are. You're the—" Voss stopped. Something in the way Logan was looking at him, or not looking at him exactly, more looking through the situation around him at what needed to happen next, caused Voss to not finish the sentence. "The center of the floor," Logan said. "Thank you." Voss moved. The power came back on at 9:31. 18 minutes, which was not a small window for a power failure in a building of this class, but the damage was contained to disruption rather than crisis. The fire suppression system had not activated. Building ops had isolated the fault to a distribution panel that had overloaded due to the additional electrical demand of the event's lighting setup. A miscalculation in the event's technical planning that would become a significant conversation between Brielle and the events company in the days following. By the time the lights came on, General Holt was seated in a chair near the north wall with a proper bandage from the building's first aid kit pressed to the cut above his ear. The bleeding had mostly stopped. A car had been called for him. He would see his personal physician in the morning and would be fine. Logan was standing about 20 feet away near the service corridor entrance, making notes on a small notepad. Incident documentation. Brielle had asked him to record the timeline while it was fresh. He heard the footsteps before Avery reached him, because he always heard footsteps. "I need to ask you something," she said. He turned. She was looking at him with that same expression from the floor, the controlled one with something real underneath. "The suppression system," he said. "It was checked. You should have a full report from building ops by, not about the suppression system." She glanced down for just a moment, and he understood a fraction of a second before she said it what she was looking at. "That insignia, on your left boot." Logan looked down. The lacing of his boot had shifted during the evening, from crouching beside the general, from moving through the crowd, and the small worn patch near the ankle had become more visible than it usually was. A symbol worked into the leather years ago. Small, precise. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you knew what you were looking for. He laced his boot more tightly. When he looked up, he saw that across the room, General Holt was watching him. The old man's expression was steady, unreadable, and then it shifted, just slightly, into something that might have been recognition and something that might have been respect. And in the warm light of a restored room full of expensive clothes and unanswered questions, Logan Pierce, janitor, stood beside a mop he hadn't touched in 40 minutes and felt the past moving toward him like weather. He kept his face neutral. He was very good at that. The room had recovered the way expensive rooms recover from disruption, quickly, almost aggressively, as though the inconvenience needed to be erased from everyone's memory before it could become a story. Catering staff refilled glasses. The ambient music resumed. People rearranged themselves into their previous conversations with the particular determination of those who understood that continuing normally was itself a kind of statement. Logan watched it happen from beside the service corridor entrance and found it neither surprising nor interesting. He'd seen rooms recover before. He'd seen them not recover too, and he knew the difference, and this one was fine. What wasn't entirely fine was the way Avery Sinclair was still standing 4 feet away from him, waiting. She hadn't left after he'd tightened his bootlace. Most people would have. Most people would have read the silence as a closed door and moved on, because the social contract of this building was that you didn't press the janitor on personal matters, partly out of indifference, and partly because pressing the janitor implied you thought he had something worth pressing on. And that was a thing very few people in this building had ever seriously entertained. Avery was not most people. He was starting to understand that more clearly. "That symbol," she said again. Not aggressive, not demanding, just precise, the way she apparently was about most things. "I've seen it once before. In a classified defense briefing about 4 years ago. It was used to identify a specific unit. The briefing didn't give the unit a name." Logan looked at her steadily. "A lot of symbols look like other symbols. This one doesn't." Across the room, General Holt was being helped to his feet by 2 of his companions. The bandage above his ear was neat. He was steady. He caught Logan's eye for a fraction of a second, and the look between them was brief and carried a weight that had nothing to do with the evening. "I should check in with facilities," Logan said. "You directed a crowd of 200 people in a power failure," Avery said. "You assessed a head injury in the dark and coordinated with building systems in under 3 minutes. You told me which system to check before anyone else in this room had identified it as a risk." She paused. "I've worked with a lot of people. I know what training looks like." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone caught. The silence of someone deciding how much a particular moment was worth. "I appreciate the observation," he said. "I'm going to go check the service corridor." She let him go. He felt her watching him as he moved, and he didn't look back, and he counted that as the smaller of 2 available problems. The service corridor on 32 was a narrow, fluorescent-lit passage that ran behind the main floor, accessible through an unmarked door near the elevator bank. It was where catering kept staging equipment and where Logan stored the secondary supplies he needed for longer shifts. It smelled like cleaning solution and old cardboard. He leaned against the wall and exhaled. Not dramatically, not with his hands on his knees or anything like that. Just a slow, controlled breath out, the kind that had become second nature a long time ago when he'd learned that the body's stress responses were not optional, but the expression of them was. He'd been doing this since he was 23 years old, in a context that had nothing to do with corporate events. He didn't go there often. He'd gotten reasonably good at not going there. He pulled out his notepad and finished the incident report for Brielle. Timeline, sequence of actions, current status of the general, confirmation of the suppression system check. He wrote it in the shorthand he'd developed. Not military shorthand exactly, more a personal hybrid he'd never bothered analyzing. And when he was done, it was complete and accurate and contained exactly as much information as Brielle needed. He put the notepad away. Then he pushed off the wall and went back to work, because that was what you did. Brielle found him 20 minutes later near the east bathroom corridor. "Whatever you did out there," she said. "Thank you." She was mid-40s, originally from somewhere in the Midwest, and she had the drained, grateful look of someone whose event had nearly become a disaster, and hadn't. "Hendricks from Building Ops said you were the one who flagged the suppression system." "Standard procedure." "Standard procedure for who?" She said it genuinely curious, not suspicious. "Because I've done 40 of these events, and I've never had a facilities person know to ask about suppression before fire suppression knew to ask about suppression. I read the building's emergency management plan when I started." Brielle looked at him for a moment. "The full plan?" "It was a slow week." She made a short sound that was approximately a laugh. "I'm putting you in my contact list for every event I do in this building." "I appreciate it." "I mean it. You want the overtime rate for tonight plus the emergency response hours? I'll make sure, whatever the standard rate is." She looked at him again with the particular expression of someone filing information. Then she nodded and went back to managing the recovery of her event, and Logan went back to his corridor. He almost made it through the rest of the evening without further incident. At 10:50, as the event was winding down and catering had begun the quiet logistics of cleanup, Logan was in the north corridor collecting waste bins when he heard Voss's voice behind him. It was not the public voice Voss used in meetings. It was the quieter one, the one for conversations that weren't meant to be overhead, but were loud enough that the speaker had decided they didn't care if they were. "Did you see him, during the whole thing, running around like he had some kind of plan?" Logan kept working. "Probably seen a lot of fire drills," said a second voice. One of the men who usually orbited Voss, Logan thought, though he didn't turn to confirm it. "It's a liability thing, honestly. Building lets a janitor play emergency coordinator. Something goes wrong. Who do you think gets sued?" Voss's voice had the particular quality of a man constructing a narrative that put him on the right side of something. "Sinclair actually talked to him. Did you see that?" "I saw." "I'll be saying something about that. Liability and optics, both. You don't let your CEO be seen taking direction from—" Logan set down the waste bin, turned around, and looked at Voss. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Voss stopped mid-sentence. His companion went very still. The particular quality of Logan's silence, not angry, not wounded, not performing anything at all, seemed to create a problem that Voss's usual social toolkit was not equipped to solve. The man was accustomed to reactions. Argument or deference or the wounded silence of someone who was hurt and showing it. What he was not accustomed to was being looked at the way Logan was looking at him, with the calm, complete attention of someone who had long ago placed certain things too far below him to be reached. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then Logan picked up the bin and turned back to his work. Behind him, Voss said nothing further. After a moment, he heard 2 sets of footsteps move away down the corridor. The general found him at 11:20. The event was essentially over by then. Most guests had gone. Catering was in full breakdown mode. Avery Sinclair had left 20 minutes earlier. Logan had seen her at the elevator with 2 of her executive assistants, still in work mode even in an evening dress, phone in hand, the controlled face of someone processing a complicated evening. Holt came down the service corridor from the direction of the main floor, walking steadily, one hand touching the wall only once, briefly, near the far end. The bandage above his ear was showing a faint rust-colored spot, but holding. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who knew his body well enough to know its current limits and was not going to pretend otherwise. Logan saw him coming and waited. "You should be in a car," Logan said when the general was close enough. "Car's waiting downstairs." Holt's voice was dry, measured, with the residual authority of a man who had given orders in rooms that mattered. "I wanted a minute." Logan nodded. The general looked at him for a long moment. The fluorescent light in the service corridor was not flattering to anyone, but it was honest, and in the honest light, Raymond Holt looked at Logan Pierce with an expression that held several things at once: recognition, something that might have been respect, and underneath both of those, a question he was working out how to ask. "Spectre 7, Holt said quietly. Logan kept his face still. "I was on the oversight committee," Holt said. "Briefly. 72 hours of briefings on 4 units, and then they pulled my clearance level on 2 of them, which told me plenty on its own." He paused. "I never saw faces, just unit designations and operational summaries. But that symbol..." He glanced briefly at Logan's left boot. "That's not something you put on consumer footwear." "It's an old pair of boots," Logan said. "I know what it is." Holt said it without heat. "And I know what the operational profile was. And I know that the men in that unit, the very few men who were in that unit, were required to hold a skill set that doesn't come from reading emergency management plans." The general's eyes were steady. "What I don't know is why one of them is mopping the executive floor at Nexarion Group." The corridor was quiet except for the distant noise of catering breakdown on the main floor. Logan was quiet for a moment, too, not deciding whether to answer. He'd already decided that, but choosing what answer meant the least damage and the most honesty, because he'd always thought those 2 things should point in the same direction when possible. "I needed work," he said. "It was available." Holt was silent. "I have a daughter," Logan said. "She's 8. She needs health insurance and regular meals and someone who comes home at a predictable time." He paused. "The floor buffer wheel's broken, and I've been putting in requests to get it fixed for 2 months. That's the kind of problem I deal with now." The general looked at him for a long time. "The Morrow incident," he said carefully. The name landed in the corridor and sat there. Logan had not heard it said out loud by another person in 3 years. He had heard it in his own head, in the particular frequency that old things occupy when they're not resolved but are being managed. He heard it now, and his expression didn't change, and that was the truest measure of how far he'd come. "That file is sealed," Logan said. "I know it is." "Then we shouldn't be discussing it in a catering corridor." Holt acknowledged this with a slight nod. "I'm not asking about the operation. I'm asking about the man who walked away from it." He paused. "Because that was not a small decision. Whatever the summary said about your separation, and I have the strong impression the summary was not entirely complete, walking away from that unit cost you everything you'd built." Logan looked at the far wall. Something in his jaw shifted slightly and then settled. "Yeah," he said. "It did." Another silence. This one was different, less like 2 strangers and more like 2 people who had both spent time in rooms where certain silences were the only honest response available. "I don't know what you did," Holt said. "Specifically. I don't need to. But I know the kind of man who walks away from an operational unit on principle, in the middle of a contract, knowing exactly what it'll cost him. There aren't many of those." He paused. "There used to be more." Logan looked back at him. "How's your head?" Holt made a sound that was approximately a dry laugh. "It's been worse." He straightened slightly. "The young woman, Sinclair, she's sharper than she knows she is." "I think she knows." "Maybe. She asked me about you after you walked away. I told her I didn't know your background." "That's accurate." "It is." Holt looked at him with the steady patience of someone who had more to say and had decided to say it plainly. "She'll find out anyway. People like that usually do, eventually. And whatever she finds..." He stopped, choosing words. "The version of events that was recorded is not necessarily the version that serves you." Logan held the general's gaze. "I know." "You should consider who gets to tell the story." Holt buttoned his jacket carefully, one-handed, testing the shoulder he'd come down on. "That's my professional opinion, for whatever it's worth from an old man with a bandaged head." He extended his hand. Logan shook it. The grip was firm, unhurried, the grip of someone who had shaken a lot of hands in a long life and meant this one. "Get in your car," Logan said. "On my way." The general walked back toward the main floor without looking back, and his footsteps on the marble had the measured weight of someone choosing each one with full intention. Logan stood in the service corridor for a moment after the footsteps faded. The version of events that was recorded is not necessarily the version that serves you. He'd known that for 3 years. He'd known it in the way you know certain things that you can't do anything about. Carried the knowledge the way you carry an old injury, present, mostly manageable, periodically making itself felt when the weather changed. He picked up the waste bin and went back to work. Janitor. He got home at 1:15 in the morning. Emma was at Patrice's, so the apartment was quiet in a way it usually wasn't, with a stillness that felt different from peaceful. He took off his jacket and hung it up. He took off the boots last, as he always did, setting them by the door with the deliberateness of someone who had learned to be deliberate about small things when the large things were out of control. He looked at the left boot for a moment. The symbol was barely visible now, the leather darkened around it with age, the mark worn to a shadow of what it had been. He'd kept the boots for practical reasons. They were the best constructed footwear he'd ever owned, built for conditions that made corporate gala floors look like a walking track. They would outlast any 3 pairs of normal boots. That was what he told himself. He was approximately 60% sure it was true. He made tea, which he never drank, and then didn't drink the tea, and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the lamplight with the city making its late-night sounds outside. Morrow. He didn't let himself go there fully. He never did, anymore. He allowed himself the edge of it, the bare facts, the outline, stripped of the parts that still had heat. And then he put it back where he kept it. The operation had been real. The order had been real. And the civilians in that village had been real. And their realness was the entire reason he'd done what he'd done. And he would do it again. And it had cost him his career and his clearance and 2 years of his life. And he had never publicly explained any of it, because explaining it would have required accessing information he didn't have the right to access anymore, and because the kind of men who gave that order were the kind of men who controlled what the explanation looked like. So he cleaned floors. He cleaned floors, and he came home to his daughter, and he read emergency management plans during slow weeks, and he built a small, specific life around the things that couldn't be taken from him as easily as the other things had been. That was what he had. That was, he had concluded, enough. He washed out the tea mug, turned off the lamp, went to bed. Come on. He picked Emma up from Patrice's at 9 the next morning. She was wearing the jacket she'd decided was her favorite 3 months ago and had not removed from her preferred clothing rotation since. And she was carrying a new cardboard structure that she had apparently constructed at Patrice's the night before, a flat rectangular shape with a series of internal compartments that she explained on the walk home was a parking garage for small vehicles. "Do we have small vehicles?" Logan asked. "We have 3 toy cars from when I was little. They're in the closet." "I thought those were gone." "I put them in a box when I was trying to be grown up," Emma said. "I've reconsidered." He looked at her. She was watching the sidewalk with the focused expression she had when she was thinking carefully about something. She had a small cut on her left hand from what had apparently been a cardboard construction incident, a thin red line across 2 knuckles that Patrice had bandaged with a dinosaur Band-Aid. "Patrice said you worked late," Emma said. "Event at the building. Were you in charge of things?" He considered how to answer that. "I helped out." She nodded, the way she did when she was accepting an answer while reserving the right to return to the subject. She was very good at that. He had no idea where she'd gotten it. They walked the rest of the way home with the parking garage between them and the city going about its Saturday business around them. And Logan thought about generals and service corridors and boots with old symbols and a CEO who looked at things directly and saw them. And he decided that the walk home was the thing that mattered right now. And he kept walking. Monday morning, 6:47. The elevator doors opened onto 32. He took out his mop. He started at the far end of the east corridor, where the marble caught the early light, and held it. And he worked methodically with overlapping strokes and no wasted motion, and the broken wheel dragged and screeched at the turn, same as always. At 7:15, Avery Sinclair came off the elevator 40 minutes earlier than usual. She was in her work clothes, which meant she'd been up for a while, which meant the weekend had involved working, which he found unsurprising. She walked toward her office and then stopped. He kept mopping. "I made some calls over the weekend," she said. He did not look up immediately. He finished the stroke he was on, then turned. "Ms. Sinclair?" She was looking at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize as her thinking face, stripped of social performance, just the actual face of someone processing. "I want you to know that I didn't find what I was looking for," she said, which, in my experience, usually means I was looking in the right direction. He held the mop handle and said nothing. "There's a sealed personnel file at the Department of Defense attached to a service number that I found because General Holt gave me a small amount of additional information after his car arrived Friday night." She paused. "He didn't tell me what was in it. He told me that the person it belonged to was someone whose judgment he would trust in a crisis." Another pause. "He'd just had fairly direct evidence of that, so I took it seriously." Logan looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to ask you to tell me things you don't want to tell me," Avery said. "That's not what this is. For the first time since he'd met her, she seemed to reach the edge of her precision. "I run a company that does security consulting for corporations, among other things. We have people on the payroll whose entire professional value is their ability to assess and respond to exactly the kind of situation that happened Friday night. And most of them are not as good at it as you were." "I've had some practice," Logan said. "I know. How much do you know?" "Very little. By design, it seems." She said it without frustration, which he respected. "I know the unit designation from the briefing. I know the general's assessment. I know what I watched you do Friday night." She looked at him in that direct, present way. "I know you're mopping my floors." The corridor was quiet. "Ms. Sinclair," Logan said, and then paused, because he was choosing carefully. "Whatever you think you know or don't know, I need the work. I need the schedule. I need the health coverage. Those are the facts of my situation, and they don't change because of what happened Friday." He paused. "I'm not saying this because I'm embarrassed about the job. I'm saying it because I want to be clear about what I need." She held his gaze without flinching. Then something in her expression shifted into what he thought might be its most genuine form. Not warm exactly, but honest, and honest in the right direction. "What if the job changed?" she said. The word sat in the marble corridor between them, in the early morning quiet, while the city outside began another day. Logan looked at her for a long moment. The mop was still in his hand. The bucket wheel would screech on the next turn, same as it always did. "I'd need to think about it," he said. It was not a no. And from the way she nodded, measured, careful, like someone who had just confirmed a calculation, she understood exactly what it was. She didn't press him that morning. That surprised him more than the question itself. In his experience, people who operated at Avery Sinclair's level of professional intensity had a tendency to treat silence as a negotiating position, as something to be filled, managed, redirected. They asked follow-up questions. They restated their offers in different language. They found angles. She didn't do any of that. She said good morning and went to her office and let him finish mopping the corridor. And the rest of Monday passed the way Mondays usually passed on 32. Meetings cycling through the boardroom, executives moving in purposeful clusters, Stacy Drummond making a comment near the copy room that Logan didn't fully hear and didn't try to. He did his work. He went home. He made Emma's lunch for the next day and helped her install the 3 recovered toy cars into the cardboard parking garage, which required some architectural modifications to the second level that Emma directed with complete authority. He thought about the question across 3 days without landing anywhere conclusive. What if the job changed? The problem with the question was that it had more than one layer, and the layers didn't all point in the same direction. On the surface, it was simple. Avery was offering him something better pay, better title, work that was closer to what he'd actually been trained for. Any reasonable person calculating their options would say yes without significant deliberation. But Logan had spent 3 years building a life on a particular architecture. Predictable hours, clear expectations, work that went home with him only in the physical sense, tired muscles, sometimes a sore back, but not in his head, not in the way that other work had lived in his head, occupying the space behind his eyes at 2 a.m. and asking questions he couldn't always answer. The janitor job was, among other things, something he could fully leave at the end of the day. He wasn't sure the job Avery was describing had that quality. And there was Emma to consider. There was always Emma to consider. Not as a burden, never that, but as the fixed coordinate around which everything else had to be navigated. She was 8, and she was building cardboard cities, and she needed someone who came home on time and wasn't somewhere in his head when he was supposed to be helping with subtraction. He was still thinking about it on Thursday morning when Voss's situation changed the entire shape of the week. He heard about it the way he heard most things on 32, not from being told, but from proximity. He was replacing a light panel in the corridor outside the executive conference rooms when two of the associate directors came out of a meeting, still mid-conversation and not looking in his direction, in the way that people didn't look at him in hallways. Completely blindsided, from what I understand. Compliance found it in the quarterly audit. How bad? Bad enough that legal's already involved. The contracts with the Meridian account, the billing codes were wrong on purpose, not by accident. 3/4 of intentional misrouting. Voss signed off on those? Voss initiated those. That's the problem. A pause. The sound of footsteps slowing. Sinclair called him in this morning. I don't think it went well. The footsteps moved away. Logan finished the light panel installation. He folded the stepladder, collected his kit, and moved on to the next task on his list, which was the supply closet on the south side. He didn't feel satisfaction about what he'd overheard. That was the honest answer. He'd expected to feel some fraction of it, some small human vindication, and he didn't. Voss's situation was Voss's situation, and it had nothing to do with Logan. And the energy required for vindication was energy that served no purpose he could identify. He'd learned that from practice, too. A long time ago, someone had told him that resentment was a weight you carried alone, and he'd found that to be accurate. What he did feel was something more neutral, a faint awareness that the architecture of the 32nd floor was shifting, and that shifts had consequences he couldn't fully predict. He found out the rest of it at lunch. He ate in the small break room on the 31st floor, which had a different population than the executive break room. Junior staff, administrative assistants, one of the IT technicians who came up to do maintenance on the executive floor's systems periodically. Logan sat at the end table with a sandwich he'd made the night before and a book he'd been reading in slow increments for 2 weeks. People talked around him with the comfortable lack of self-consciousness that came from his presence being so consistently neutral. The IT technician, a young man named Ben who wore the same rotation of band t-shirts every week and had once spent 15 minutes telling Logan about a documentary on signal encryption that Logan had found genuinely interesting, sat down across the table without invitation. He did this occasionally. Logan didn't mind it. "Crazy morning," Ben said. "So I've heard." "You heard about Voss?" "Some of it." Ben had the contained energy of someone who had information and was making good decisions about how to distribute it. Compliance found billing fraud across multiple accounts. Not small. We're talking about the kind of numbers where criminal referral is a real possibility, not just a threat. Word is Sinclair suspended him pending investigation. He paused. Escorted out at 10:30, keycard deactivated. The whole thing. Logan ate his sandwich. "He was here for 12 years, Ben said more quietly. "Not that I'm saying. I mean, if he did what they're saying, then it is what it is. But 12 years. A pause. Sinclair didn't look angry, apparently. She just looked like she was doing math. That was, Logan thought, probably accurate. "The other thing," Ben said, "and this is the floor talking, not me personally, there's apparently been some kind of staffing conversation happening above my pay grade. Something about security restructuring. Nobody knows exactly." He glanced at Logan, and it was a slightly different glance from his usual ones. "Someone mentioned your name." Logan looked at him evenly. "I'm just saying what I heard," Ben said, raising both hands mildly. "You're good at this job? I'm not sure you're supposed to just be this job, you know what I mean?" He stood up, gathering his lunch things. "Anyway, documentary recommendation for the week. There's one on deep-sea navigation systems that's better than it sounds." He left. Logan sat with his sandwich and the city outside the break room window, and thought that the building, like most buildings, knew more about itself than it let on. Avery called him to her office at 3:15, not through a message or an email. She sent her assistant, a young woman named Claire, who had the perpetually organized manner of someone managing multiple competing priorities at once, to find him. Claire delivered the request with the careful neutrality of someone who'd been instructed to be careful and neutral. Logan put away his supplies and followed her back. He'd never been inside Avery Sinclair's office. He'd cleaned the floor outside it. He'd seen through the glass partition occasionally. A large desk, deliberately clear, a standing lamp in the corner, a single framed photograph on the wall whose subject he'd never been close enough to make out. In person, the office was exactly what he'd have expected. Functional and precise, nothing decorative that didn't serve a purpose. The arrangement of furniture designed for productivity rather than impression. 2 chairs across from the desk. A credenza along the side wall with a neat stack of documents. A whiteboard covered in what appeared to be a flow chart that someone had started and not yet finished. Avery was standing at the window when he came in, the way people stand at windows when they have something to say and are deciding the sequence of it. She turned when she heard him enter. "Close the door," she said. He did. "Sit down." He considered standing on principle and then decided that was the kind of thing you did to make a point, and the point it made was a small one. He sat. She came away from the window and sat at her desk. She had a folder open in front of her, and he caught a glimpse of a document header before she closed it. A government letterhead, Defense Department, and then nothing because she closed it. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "Is that acceptable?" "I prefer it. I've spent the past 3 days trying to get more information about your background. I've had our legal team make inquiries, and I've used a personal contact in the Department of Defense who owes me a significant favor." She looked at him steadily. "Everything with your name on it is either sealed, redacted, or does not exist. The discharge papers I was able to access list your separation reason as administrative. No other detail." A pause. "In my experience, when a file looks like it was cleaned by professionals, it means 2 things. Either the person in question did something genuinely bad, and it was covered up, or they were genuinely good, and it was covered up, usually for different reasons." Logan folded his hands in his lap. "General Holt called me Tuesday morning," Avery continued. "He didn't tell me operational specifics. He told me his assessment of your character, which was—" She paused, and he thought something moved briefly behind her eyes. He was fairly emphatic. "He's a generous man," Logan said. "He's a careful man. There's a difference." She held his gaze. "I'm going to ask you one direct question, and I want a direct answer, not the full story. I understand there may be things you can't or won't say, and I respect that. Just one thing." He waited. "Did you leave that unit because you refused to do something that would have hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt?" The question settled in the office. The city moved outside the window. Somewhere down the corridor, a printer ran a job. "Yes," Logan said. Avery held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone completing a calculation. "That's what I thought," she said. "And that's why I'm about to make you an offer, us." She laid it out with the clarity she brought to most things. The position was head of corporate security for Nexarion Group, a senior role that had been occupied for the past 2 years by a man named Garrett, who was, Avery explained with the measured frankness of someone done being diplomatic about the topic, not suited to it. Garrett had institutional knowledge and 0 actual security instinct, and what Nexarion's security apparatus needed in the current environment was not institutional knowledge. It was judgment. The role covered physical security for all Nexarion facilities, crisis response protocol, threat assessment for high-value client engagements, and oversight of the contracted security vendors across 3 regional offices. It came with a salary that was 4 times what Logan currently made. Benefits, including substantially better health coverage, regular hours with predictable on-call expectations, a small team of 6 direct reports. She laid it out and then stopped talking and looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you offering this to me specifically? You have a candidate pool. You have an HR process." "I do. Use them." "I'm going to use them to fill the position if you decline," she said. "But that's not how I'm handling this. I watched you manage a crisis in real time. I've now had a reference from a retired 4-star general. And I've run every background check I'm legally able to run, which is limited but not nothing." She paused. "I'm a person who makes decisions based on evidence. The evidence points here." "What you don't know could be a problem," he said. "Tell me what I don't know." He looked at the framed photograph on the wall. It was a woman, Older, mid-60s in the photo, dark hair going gray, standing in front of what looked like a modest house. She had Avery's eyes, or Avery had hers. He looked back. "The operation I walked away from," he said, choosing each word with the care of someone navigating around things that were still live. "It went forward without me, with someone else in my position. And the outcome?" He stopped. People were hurt who shouldn't have been. The way it was documented, it looked like my refusal had caused an operational gap that led to the outcome. He held her gaze. "That's the version in whatever file exists. I have no way to change it and no documentation to refute it. So if that surfaces, it doesn't change my assessment. It could change your board's assessment. It could change your legal team's. I'll manage that," Avery said. "You don't know what you'd be managing." "I know enough." She said it without bravado, the way she said most things, flatly, as a statement of operational fact. "I know that a man who refuses a direct order to protect innocent people and then accepts the consequences without making noise about it is not a man with something to hide. He's a man with something to protect." She paused. "And I know that Nexarion spent the better part of a decade as a defense contractor, and its current security infrastructure is staffed by people who've never been in a room where the stakes were real." A beat. "Friday night wasn't comfortable to watch. My building went dark, one of my guests was bleeding on the floor, and the only person who knew what to do was the man mopping the hallway. I'd like to not have that be true anymore." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her manner that reminded him of a quality he'd respected in the people he'd worked with a long time ago. Not warmth exactly, but honesty. The specific honesty of someone who had stopped performing a version of themselves and was just being the actual version. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 8. Everything I've done since I left, the schedule, the predictability, it's been for her. I need to know that this role doesn't put her back in a situation where her father is somewhere else in his head when he's supposed to be with her." Something shifted in Avery's expression. Not pity. He would have disliked pity. Something more like recognition. "What's her name?" she said. "Emma." "How long has it been just the two of you?" He'd not expected the question. 4 years, he said. She nodded slowly. "The role has defined hours. There will be situations that require response outside those hours. That's real, I won't tell you otherwise. But you'd have a team. You wouldn't be the only person who could respond to something." She paused. "And you'd make enough money that Emma's future isn't contingent on every paycheck landing correctly." That landed where she'd probably intended it to land. He looked at the floor for a moment. Not his floor anymore. Not the marble he'd spent 7 months maintaining, just a floor in an office, and then looked back up. "I need a week," he said. "You have it. And I want the broken wheel on the mop bucket fixed before I decide." She blinked. Then something happened to her expression that he hadn't seen before. A break in the precision, brief, the thing underneath showing for just a moment. And it was amusement, genuine amusement, the kind that arrives when something catches a person completely off guard. "I'll make a call," she said. Did. He told Emma that night, in the way he told her things that mattered, directly, without managing her response in advance, because she was 8 and had earned directness by virtue of consistently handling it better than most adults. He made dinner first. Real dinner. Chicken, actual vegetables. The kind of meal that took 40 minutes, which was a signal she had learned to read as meaning her father needed to think while his hands were busy. She sat at the kitchen table and worked on a drawing and waited. Over dinner, he explained it the way you explain things to a sharp 8-year-old, simply and without euphemism. A different job, better pay, more responsibility, different hours, but more consistent. Emma ate a piece of broccoli, which she normally negotiated around, and looked at him carefully. "Would you still come home for dinner?" she said. "Most nights, yes." "Would you be somewhere dangerous?" "No." The way no is actually no, or the way no is actually don't worry about it? He looked at his daughter. She had her mother's dark eyes and apparently had also inherited whatever it was in him that spotted the gap between what was said and what was meant. "The way no is actually no," he said. "This is a desk job, with some walking around." "You hate desk jobs." "I haven't had one." You make a face when you watch TV shows where people have desk jobs. He thought about this. The desk part is smaller than the job part, he said. Emma considered this carefully, eating another piece of broccoli. This was clearly a significant deliberation. She put her fork down. Is it because of the emergency thing at your building? He told her about the power failure in general terms. Building issue, he'd helped. Everything was fine. She had absorbed this with the same careful attention she applied to most things. Partly, he said. The lady who runs the company, she offered it? She did. Emma picked her fork back up. Is she nice? He thought about Avery Sinclair in the service corridor, in her office, at the window. He thought about the way she'd looked at him, directly, without the performance of it. She's honest, he said, which is better than nice, usually. Emma appeared to find this answer satisfactory. She ate for a moment in silence, and then, the parking garage needs a third level. I was thinking about it today. Structurally challenging, he said. I have ideas. They finished dinner. He ran into Stacy Drummond on Friday morning, his second-to-last day before his decision deadline. She came around the corner near the copy room while he was doing the waste bins and nearly walked into the cart, and she said something sharp and automatic, "Watch it," before she registered who it was, and then her expression went through a visible transition from irritated to the particular discomfort of someone who has just remembered a context they would have preferred to forget. The week had moved fast since Monday. Voss was gone, and the absence of his particular energy on the floor had changed the room in ways that were hard to articulate. It was quieter, but not a comfortable quiet. More like the quiet of people recalibrating. People on the floor now looked at Logan differently. Not all of them. Some of them still looked through him the way they always had, because that was a habit, and habits were stubborn things. But enough of them looked at him with the slightly uncertain expression of people who had recently learned that what they had assumed about a situation was not accurate and didn't yet know what to do with that. Stacy Drummond was clearly among those people. She started to move around the cart, and then, to her credit, she stopped. About the things I said, she said. She said it to the middle distance rather than directly at him, in the manner of someone doing the emotional labor of an apology while not quite completing it. In the corridor, the comments. She stopped again. Logan looked at her. Not with anger. He genuinely didn't have any for her, specifically. She was someone who had read a room and done what the room seemed to encourage, which was a failure of something but not an unusual one. It's fine, he said. It's not. She stopped, started again. I didn't know who you were. You didn't need to know who I was, he said quietly. That's the thing about it. She looked at him directly then. The first time she had, he thought, in 7 months. He moved the cart past her and continued down the corridor. He heard her stand there for a moment behind him, and then he heard her footsteps move in the other direction, and then the floor went back to its ambient sound. He thought about what he'd said to her, the truth of it. You didn't need to know who I was. That was the actual thing. The wrong wasn't about who he'd been before. It had nothing to do with Spectre 7 or General Holt or any of the history he carried in the worn leather of his boots. The wrong was simpler than that, and he hadn't needed a sealed file or a general's endorsement for it to be a wrong. He'd just been a man doing a job. That was the thing nobody in this building had quite managed to understand, and that maybe Avery had come closest to. The look on her face, in the break of her expression, when he'd asked about the mop bucket wheel. Not the man with a classified past. Not the quiet hero waiting to be discovered. Just a man who needed the broken wheel fixed and had asked 3 times and hadn't gotten anywhere. He finished the waste bins. He restocked the supply cart. He submitted, for the 4th time, the maintenance request for the mop bucket wheel. When he came in Monday morning, it had been fixed. He stood beside it for a moment in the supply corridor, his hand on the handle, and tested the wheel. Smooth, clean, no drag, no screech. He thought about Emma's parking garage and the 3 recovered toy cars, and the question of a 3rd level. He thought about Morrow, briefly, and then let it go. He took the mop cart out to the floor and began his rounds, and the wheel moved without sound, and the city light came through the east windows the way it always did, and he had 3 more days before he needed to give Avery Sinclair his answer. He thought he already knew what it was going to be. He told her yes on a Wednesday. Not in her office, not with any ceremony. He found her in the East Corridor at 7:20 in the morning, which was becoming its own kind of routine. Her early, him already mid-floor, the building not yet fully awake around them. She was carrying a coffee this time, which he hadn't seen before. She looked like she hadn't slept especially well, which was a human detail he filed without comment. "Yes," he said, when she was close enough. She stopped walking, looked at him for a moment with the reading expression, the one that processed things before the face caught up. Then, "Okay, I have conditions. I assumed. The hours are what you described. I need to be home by 6:30 most evenings. If something comes up that requires me past that, I need 48 hours notice when possible, and when it's not possible, I need the flexibility to arrange coverage for Emma before I respond. Done. I want to review the team before I accept any of the current structure. If someone isn't doing the job they're supposed to be doing, I need the authority to change that. You'll have it. And I want the transition handled carefully. I'm not going to just disappear from the facilities team on short notice. Brielle is running an event in 3 weeks, and she has me on her contact list." Something moved in Avery's expression. That same brief break he'd seen once before, the thing that was genuine. "You're negotiating your own departure from the janitorial staff. I'm saying I don't leave things halfway done." She looked at him steadily. "Logan," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name, which both of them noticed. "Done. All of it." She paused. "Can you start the transition next Monday?" "Yes." She nodded once and started walking again, then stopped after 3 steps and turned back. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're making the right decision." "I think so too," he said. "Ask me again in 6 months." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The next 3 weeks were not graceful. He hadn't expected them to be, and the expectation of imperfection turned out to be the thing that made it manageable. Transitions were friction by definition. He'd known that in a professional context for a long time, and he'd mostly forgotten it in the 7 months of cleaning floors, where the work was physical and repetitive and didn't require managing people. Managing people, as it turned out, was a different category of difficult. His team of 6 came with their own histories, their own assessments of the job they were doing and whether it was being done correctly, and, in 3 cases, a visible skepticism about the qualifications of the person who had just been handed authority over them. He was, from their perspective, a janitor. That the janitor in question had a background none of them could access didn't change the immediate texture of the first 2 weeks, which required him to establish credibility through patience and consistency rather than through anything dramatic. The most direct challenge came from a man named Kovacs, mid-40s, who had been with Nexarian's security team for 6 years and had apparently assumed, not unreasonably, that when Garrett's position opened, his name would have been the natural next step. He was competent. Logan assessed that quickly. But his competence had developed in an environment with low standards, which meant it was solid in certain areas and had significant blind spots in others. He didn't know what he didn't know, which was a more serious problem than simply not knowing. Their first real conversation happened on Logan's 4th day, when Logan had asked for a complete review of the visitor access protocol for the executive floors, and Kovacs had brought him something that was administratively thorough and operationally insufficient. "Walk me through the gap between badge deactivation and security notification," Logan said. He was looking at the document. He kept his voice even. Kovacs was standing on the other side of the desk. Logan's desk now, Garrett's old desk, which was larger than the situation required and which Logan suspected had been selected for appearance rather than function. "What gap?" "When a badge is deactivated, how long before the duty officer is notified?" Kovacs paused. The system logs it. When does a person see the log?" Another pause. "End of shift review," Kovacs said. And to his credit, his tone shifted slightly as he said it. Not to defensiveness, but to the different quality of someone who had just heard the edge of a problem clearly for the first time. "If a deactivated badge is used or attempted between log reviews, nobody flags it in real time," Kovacs said. He said it flatly. "That's the gap." Logan put the document down. "I'm not telling you this as a criticism. I'm telling you because I need you to know what I'm looking for and why." A real-time alert on any deactivated badge attempt. That's the first change I want to see in the protocol. He paused. Can you have a revised version by Friday? Kovacs looked at him for a moment. The skepticism was still there, but it had shifted. Less about Logan's title and more about the actual question, which was a question Kovacs was clearly now also asking himself. Friday, Kovacs said. Yeah. It didn't make them friends, but it made them something more functional, which was what the situation needed. The other difficulty in those first weeks was more diffuse and harder to address directly. It was the matter of his reputation on the executive floor, which had not resolved cleanly after the gala. Some people had moved on. The building processed events the way buildings processed events. Quickly, partially, with the selective memory of an institution that needed to keep functioning. Most of the 32nd floor had absorbed the information that something significant had happened at the gala, that the janitor had apparently been involved, and had filed it under unusual and moved along. But some hadn't moved on. He could feel it in the way certain people registered his presence differently now, not with the automatic dismissal of before, but with a slightly uncertain quality, like they were unsure of the correct behavior when the reference point had changed. He was not the janitor anymore, but he also wasn't the kind of executive they knew how to categorize, and the gap between those two things created a social friction that neither he nor anyone else had a quick solution to. Harlan Voss, at least, was no longer a variable. His suspension had formalized into a termination 2 weeks after the gala, once legal had completed their initial review of the Meridian account documentation. Logan heard about this from Ben, who remained a reliable source of building intelligence, and he heard it without particular reaction. Voss would have consequences that were commensurate with what he'd done, or slightly less than commensurate, because that was generally how these things went. It wasn't Logan's problem to track. What he was tracking, in the methodical way he tracked things, was the actual state of Nixarion's security infrastructure, which, the more he examined it, was revealing itself to be in significantly worse shape than even Avery's frustrated summary had indicated. The contracted vendors across the 3 regional offices were billing for services that were being delivered inconsistently, in 2 cases barely at all. The threat assessment protocols for high-value client engagements were largely theoretical documents, comprehensive on paper, essentially non-functional in practice, because the people responsible for implementing them had never been trained on what the assessments were actually evaluating. The physical security systems in the main building were current in terms of hardware, but the monitoring procedures around them were outdated by at least 4 years and hadn't been adjusted for the change in office layout that had happened 2 renovations ago. It was not catastrophic. The building was not, in any immediate sense, unsafe, but it was the kind of institutional complacency that became catastrophic under the right conditions, which was a sentence Logan had said to himself about situations before, in contexts where the right conditions had a way of arriving. He worked through it systematically, which was the only way to work through something this size. He built a priority list, identified the changes that needed to happen first versus the ones that could be addressed over a quarter, and wrote it into a report for Avery that was clear and specific and did not soften the findings. She read it in a day and came to his office the morning after. His office was smaller than hers, which was how it should be, and it still didn't feel entirely like his. The desk was wrong, too large. The chair had a height adjustment that he hadn't yet figured out, and there were 2 boxes in the corner that had been Garrett's and needed to be cleared out. He'd been so busy with the operational work that the physical space had stayed in its transitional state, half claimed, half not. Avery came in with the report in her hand and sat down across from him in the visitor chair, which was an inversion of the usual dynamic that neither of them commented on. "This is worse than I thought," she said. "Some of it. The vendor contracts alone." She looked at a specific page. "We're paying for coverage we're not receiving. In 2 of the 3 regional offices, yes." "How did this go unreviewed for this long?" Logan looked at her steadily. Garrett's reviews were self-reported. Nobody external was validating the vendor performance against the contracts. Avery closed the report. She did the thing with her jaw that he'd started to recognize, a tightening, brief, the physical version of something being filed under things to address. "What do you need to fix it?" Authority to renegotiate the 2 regional contracts. A budget for a 2-day training program for the team on the assessment protocols. And Kovacs. She looked up. "Kovacs?" He's better than he's been allowed to be. He knows the building, he knows the vendors, and now that he's understood what I'm looking for, he's finding it. He paused. I want to promote him to deputy. Give him actual responsibility instead of just tenure. Avery was quiet for a moment. You're promoting the person who was most resistant to your hire. He was resistant because he'd been waiting for a job he deserved and didn't get. That's reasonable, and he dropped the resistance when the work became the point. He paused. Those are the people worth keeping. She looked at him for a longer moment than usual. Okay, she said. Then, how are you doing with the transition, practically? It was a different kind of question from her usual ones. She asked it with a care that was slightly detached from her professional manner, and he thought she probably knew she was doing that and had decided to do it anyway. Emma's adjusting, he said. She's made a structural plan for a 4th level of the parking garage, which I think is her way of processing change. A 4th level. She's optimistic about load-bearing capacity. Avery looked at the report in her hands. I have a niece, she said. She's 11. I forget her birthday approximately every other year, which she has informed me is unacceptable. She's right. I know she's right. She said it with the dry self-awareness of someone who understood their own failure clearly and was still working on it. I've been meaning to fix that. Set a calendar alert, Logan said. I have one. I dismiss it. Set 2. She looked at him, and that near smile happened again. He was starting to think it was significant that she almost smiled at things he said, because she clearly didn't almost smile often or with most people. I'll set 2, she said. The moment that changed the floor's understanding happened in the 3rd week, and it happened in public, which was not something Logan had engineered, but which he also, looking back, couldn't entirely say he'd prevented. There was a meeting in the large conference room on 32, a client presentation, one of Nick Zarian's major consulting accounts, a technology firm out of the Northeast that was reviewing its security contract. Logan had been asked to attend in his new capacity, which was the first time he'd sat in a 32nd floor meeting as a participant rather than someone who cleaned up afterward. The meeting went reasonably well for its first hour. The client's security director, a woman named Torres, who had the specific energy of someone who had been in this industry long enough to know exactly what poor preparation looked like, asked pointed questions that Logan's team had been briefed to answer. The Nexarian side of the table answered them with varying degrees of precision. Then Torres asked about the scenario response framework, which was the area where Garrett's team had been most efficient, and the executive presenting, one of the business development directors who had been leading client relations on the account, gave an answer that was technically drawn from the protocol documents but was substantively wrong. Not because he was lying, because he didn't actually know how the protocol functioned in practice. Torres looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to be polite about what they'd just heard. Logan said quietly, "The response framework has been revised since the last review. The current version uses a tiered alert system with real-time escalation pathways. The document you're referencing describes the previous iteration." Everyone at the table looked at him. Torres looked at him. "You're Logan Pierce, head of corporate security." He said it simply, without the weight of its own history. "The scenario document your team has is out of date. We can have the current version to you by end of day." Torres held his gaze for a moment, the assessing look of a professional measuring another professional. "I'd like to go through the tiered system in some detail," she said, "if that's possible now." "It is," Logan said. For the next 25 minutes, he walked her through it. Not from notes, from understanding, from the week he'd spent restructuring it, from the same source of knowledge that had told him to check the fire suppression system on the night of the gala. He answered her follow-up questions directly and said, "I don't have that data in front of me, but I'll get it to you," when that was the accurate answer, which it was twice. When it was done, Torres looked at the executive who'd been leading the presentation and then back at Logan. "I'd like the revised documents and a call next week with your team," she said. "This is closer to what we've been looking for." The meeting ended. In the corridor afterward, the executive who'd been presenting, a man named Derek Hale, who was professionally competent and not unkind and had a habit of adjusting his cufflinks when he was uncomfortable, walked alongside Logan for a few steps. "Thanks for the save in there," he said. It wasn't a save, Logan said. The protocol was new. You hadn't been briefed on it. That's a communication gap I should have caught before the meeting. Hale looked at him. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. Logan looked at him directly. Next time we have a client with security questions, I want my team in the room with yours from the preparation stage, not the day of. Agreed, Hale said, without hesitation. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not public in any theatrical sense. Just a meeting where things had gone poorly and then better, and an agreement made in a corridor, and a small shift in how the floor understood who was doing what. It spread the way things spread in a building, through assistant networks and break room conversations, and the ambient intelligence that large groups of people develop about their own environment. By the end of the week, people on 32 were greeting him by name. Not all of them. Some still passed him with the variable acknowledgement of the busy or the habitual, but enough that the change was real and specific. He noticed it in the small register of things, the nod from someone who'd never nodded before, the name used where it hadn't been, the way people held elevator doors. Small things, not nothing, mutts. On a Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks into his new role, Logan was in his office working through vendor contract revisions when Emma called his cell phone, which she only did during school hours when something was wrong. He picked up on the second ring. What happened? Nothing bad. She sounded almost offended by his tone. I have a question. He exhaled. Emma. I'm allowed to call with questions. During school. It's lunch. There's a difference. He pinched the bridge of his nose. What's the question? My teacher is doing a career day thing. She wants parents to come in and talk about their job. I told her what you do now and she wants you to come. He was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her I do? I said you're in charge of making sure bad things don't happen to people at a big company. A pause. She said that sounded important. He looked at the vendor contract on his desk. When is it? 3 weeks. Thursday morning. 3 weeks' notice. She was 8 years old and had given him 3 weeks' notice for a school commitment. He didn't know whether to feel proud or slightly unsettled by how thoroughly she'd absorbed his logistical preferences. I'll be there, he said. Okay. A pause. Can you wear the boots? Emma? They're distinctive. Miss Patterson would like them. I'll think about it. That means yes, she said, and hung up. He set the phone down and sat for a moment with the strange quality of the afternoon. The vendor contract in front of him, the office that still didn't entirely feel like his, the fixed wheel on a mop bucket he no longer used, and his daughter eating lunch somewhere and doing the ordinary arithmetic of her daily life, which was the entire reason for every decision he'd made and not made over the past 3 years. He'd worn those boots through the worst period of his life and out the other side. He'd worn them when there was nothing else familiar to hold on to. He'd worn them through marble corridors and late train rides and school pickups and 1,000 evenings of cheap pasta and cardboard architecture. He figured he'd wear them to career day. He didn't see much of Avery in those first weeks, which was appropriate. His role was not adjacent to hers in the way it had been, briefly, during the transition conversation. They were in the same building, occasionally at the same meetings, but the natural distance of their respective positions had reasserted itself in a professional way that he thought was right for both of them, which was why he was mildly surprised when she knocked on his office door on a Friday afternoon. The building mostly emptied out around them, holding 2 cups of coffee and looking like she'd had the kind of week that made people need to sit somewhere for a minute. Is this a bad time? She asked. He looked at the contract on his desk, which he'd been staring at for 20 minutes without reading. No. She set one of the cups on his desk and sat in the visitor chair, the same chair she'd sat in when she read the security report, and wrapped both hands around her own cup. She looked, in that moment, genuinely tired. Not performing anything, not in CEO mode, just a 30-year-old woman at the end of a difficult week who had walked down the hall to sit somewhere quiet for a minute. He waited. The Voss investigation expanded, she said. The fraud wasn't contained to the Meridian account. Legal found traces in 2 other client files. It goes back further than we thought. How much further? Before my tenure. She looked at the surface of her coffee. Which means it predates me. Which means I'm going to spend the next month explaining to a board why due diligence didn't catch it, And the answer is that due diligence didn't catch it because the people responsible for it weren't looking for it. And the reason they weren't looking is that Voss was well-liked and long-tenured, and the company had a culture of trusting tenure over verification. A pause. Which is a cultural problem I inherited and didn't fully dismantle in time. Logan looked at her steadily. The board knew the culture they had when they appointed you. Yes. And the fraud predates your tenure. That doesn't mean I'm comfortable with it. I know. He paused. It also means the accountability is correctly placed. You didn't create the conditions. You're responsible for fixing them. She looked up at him. The tiredness was still there, but something else came through it. The particular focus of someone who had said something out loud that they needed to hear said back differently. That's a reasonable way to frame it, she said. It's the accurate frame. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, the city was doing its Friday evening thing, shifting from work to something else, the light changing, the sound of it changing. He'd watched this view every day for 3 weeks from a different height than before, and it was the same city, but the angle made it look different, the way angles tended to. Can I ask you something personal? She said. He nodded. The morning you decided to take the job, you came in and said yes in the hallway. What was the thing that actually decided it? He looked at the window for a moment. The mop bucket wheel, he said. She waited. I put in 4 requests over 2 months to get it fixed. 4. And nothing happened until you made one call. He looked back at her. I thought about Emma's school, the health insurance, the schedule, all of it. But the thing that was actually in my head when I woke up Wednesday morning was the wheel. And what the wheel meant. He paused. It meant that for as long as I was in that role, the things I needed in order to do the work properly were going to be secondary to whatever else the building needed from whoever it needed it from. And I've been in enough situations where the people responsible for making sure something works are the last to get what they need. And I decided I was done being that person. Avery held his gaze. She said nothing for a long moment, then, for what it's worth, I genuinely didn't know about the wheel. I know you didn't. I should have. You're the CEO of a corporation with several hundred employees. You shouldn't be tracking mop bucket maintenance requests. No, but I should have built a culture where someone responsible for those requests was. She said it with the quiet weight of someone who wasn't being self-flagellating, just precise about something they'd understood recently. That's the same problem as Voss. Different scale, same root. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. It is. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The city outside was filling with the kind of golden late light that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. And they sat in the quiet of a Friday emptied office, 2 people who had arrived at the same floor from entirely different directions. And something in the room was different from every conversation they'd had before. Not the professional, careful quality of their early exchanges, and not the searching quality of the gala's aftermath, but something more like 2 people who had cleared enough space between them to simply be in the same room without an agenda. It was not romantic. It was not nothing either. It was the specific, rare quality of a genuine mutual regard, still finding its shape, too early to name, real enough to notice. I should let you get back to it, she said, standing. She took her cup. Kovach's deputy paperwork is on your desk, he said. It needs your signature. I'll look at it tonight. She paused at the door. How'd Emma take the new schedule? She gave me 3 weeks' notice for a school event, he said. I think she's adapting. Avery did smile this time. Actually smiled. Brief, genuine, the kind that changed the whole shape of her face for just a second. That sounds like she's doing better than most adults I know. She'd agree with that assessment, he said. Avery left. He sat in the quiet for a moment, the coffee warm in his hands, the light doing what late light did to cities through glass. And he thought about a parking garage with a 4th level, and a kid who gave 3 weeks' notice, and a wheel that had finally been fixed, and the particular texture of a life that was, against the considerable weight of evidence at certain points, still being built. It was not a clean feeling. It was too complicated for clean. But it was real, and it was his, and he thought, cautiously, the way he thought about most things that mattered, that it might be enough. He turned back to the vendor contract. There was still work to do. The call came on a Tuesday. Logan was in the middle of a vendor review meeting when his cell phone vibrated on the desk beside him. personal cell, not the work line, which he kept separate with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the border between those two phones was also a border between two versions of his life. He glanced at the screen. No name. A number with a Virginia area code he didn't recognize, which meant he recognized it completely, because numbers from people in that world never came attached to names. He let it go to voicemail. Kovacs was presenting the revised monitoring protocol for the regional offices, which had taken 3 weeks to rebuild and was now, in Logan's assessment, something that would actually function under real conditions rather than just read well in a compliance audit. He paid attention to Kovacs. The work deserved his attention, and the call, whatever it was, would still be there in an hour. When the meeting ended and Kovacs had gone back to his desk with the particular focused energy of someone who'd been given a real job and was doing it, Logan sat in his office and played the voicemail. It was 43 seconds long. The voice was male, mid-range, controlled. The specific controlled quality of someone trained to give nothing in tone or inflection. He didn't recognize the voice directly, but he recognized the category of the voice. The way you recognize a particular accent without knowing the specific person who speaks it. The message said that a mutual acquaintance had passed along Logan's current situation, that the caller represented an organization with interests that aligned with Logan's previous experience, that there was a particular matter requiring someone with a very specific operational profile, and Logan's name had come up. That it would be a short engagement, the word engagement said with the slight weight of someone who knew what the word meant in that context. That the compensation would be substantial, that the caller would appreciate a callback at his convenience. Logan deleted the voicemail. He sat for a moment looking at the vendor contract on his desk, the same one he'd been staring at last Friday, now annotated with 2 pages of handwritten notes, fully alive in a way it hadn't been before Kovacs' presentation filled in the last gaps in his understanding. Then he picked up his phone and called Emma's school to confirm he was still on the calendar for career day Thursday morning. The receptionist confirmed it. Yes, 3rd grade, Ms. Patterson's class, 9:15. Thank you, Logan said, and hung up and went back to work. Damned. He didn't tell anyone about the call that day. Not Avery, not Kovacs, not Terrence downstairs, who still gave him a nod every morning out of a habit that had outlasted Logan's janitorial tenure. He didn't tell anyone because there was nothing to tell. A call had come, he had deleted it, and that was the complete story. People who had lived in certain worlds received calls like that the way other people receive spam emails. You recognized them for what they were, and you cleared them out. The difficulty was that this particular call didn't entirely clear out. It didn't keep him up that night. He slept fine, which was itself a kind of data point. 3 years ago, a call like that would have activated something in him that made sleep a theoretical concept for a week. He slept fine, made Emma's lunch in the morning, argued mildly with her about whether the green container or the blue container was the appropriate vessel for cut apples. She maintained the blue one. He thought it made no difference. She explained in careful detail why she was right, and drove her to school. But the call stayed somewhere in his peripheral awareness the way a distant sound stays. Not demanding, not disruptive, but present. A frequency he couldn't entirely tune out because some part of him was still, at some level below decision-making, wired to hear it. He thought about that on the drive back from school, in the particular quiet of a car after a child has been dropped off. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about things that mattered, without managing the answer in advance. The honest answer was that part of him understood the call, not agreed with it, not wanted it, understood it. There was a version of him, not far below the surface even now, that had been built for exactly what the caller was describing. Built carefully, over years, in conditions that were designed to make that building permanent. The skills didn't leave. The instincts didn't leave. The particular quality of focus that came with high-stakes operational work, the way the world sharpened and simplified when everything unnecessary fell away. He still felt the echo of that sometimes, in the way veterans feel the echo of their service long after the service ends. That wasn't shame. It wasn't something to fix. It was just true. The question was what you did with true. On. Career day was on a Thursday morning that came in clear and cold for March, the kind of morning that made the city look sharp-edged and deliberate. Logan wore the boots. Ms. Patterson's third-grade classroom was a room that had been organized by someone who understood that 8-year-olds needed both structure and color. A balance, the room struck reasonably well, with assigned seats and labeled cubbies alongside a wall of student artwork and a reading corner with a slightly lopsided beanbag chair. Logan had been in this room twice before for parent-teacher conferences, but it looked different now with 22 children in it, all facing the front with the calibrated attention of kids who had been told a parent was coming and had strong opinions about whether this was interesting. Emma was in the third row. She gave him a look when he walked in that communicated approximately 6 things at once, the primary one being that she was watching his performance and expected it to be acceptable. Ms. Patterson was a woman in her mid-30s with the organized warmth of a good teacher and an expression that said she had been doing this long enough to have seen all the varieties of parent career day and was genuinely uncertain which category this one would fall into. "Mr. Pierce, thank you for coming," she said. "We usually do about 15 minutes and then questions." "That works," he said. He stood at the front of the classroom and looked at 22 8-year-olds who looked back at him with the frank, evaluating gaze of children who hadn't yet learned to pretend they weren't evaluating. He thought about what to say for a second and decided to say the true thing. "My job," he said, "is to make sure that bad things don't happen to people where I work. And when they do happen, because sometimes they do, no matter how much you prepare, my job is to make sure those people are safe and that things get fixed." He paused. "Before I had this job, I cleaned floors in the same building, and before that, I was a soldier." A hand went up in the second row. A small boy with a superhero backpack hanging on his chair. "What kind of soldier?" "The kind that does dangerous things in quiet places." "Like a spy?" "Not exactly." "Like a ninja?" "A little more like a ninja," Logan said, and the room produced the particular noise of 22 children finding something funnier than expected. He talked for 15 minutes. He talked about what security actually meant. Not in the action movie sense, not in the sense of guns and danger, but in the everyday operational sense of anticipating problems before they became emergencies, of knowing a building well enough to understand where its vulnerabilities were, of building a team that trusted each other because trust was a functional requirement and not just a nice thing to have. He talked about it in language that was honest without being complicated, because the honest version and the complicated version were different things, and 22 8-year-olds deserved the honest one. Somewhere in the middle of it, he stopped being aware of performing and was just talking. That was the marker, he'd learned, of when you were actually saying something real. The questions afterward were wide-ranging. Several involved whether he had ever been in an explosion. One involved whether he knew any famous people. One, from a girl in the back row with a serious expression, asked whether his job was scary. He thought about that one for a moment. "Parts of it used to be," he said. "The job I have now, no. The job I had before, sometimes." He paused. "The thing I learned is that scared isn't the problem. Scared is just information. The question is what you do with it." The girl in the back row nodded with the gravity of someone receiving useful intelligence. Emma was watching him from the third row with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Part assessment, part something quieter, something that might have been, if he was reading it right, a kind of quiet pride that she was working not to show because she was 8 and had a reputation to maintain. He drove back to work with that expression somewhere in his chest, doing what it did. The second call came 10 days later. Same area code, different number, same controlled voice. This time he didn't let it go to voicemail. He answered because deleting the first one had not ended the conversation, and ignoring things that weren't going away was a different thing from choosing not to engage with them. "I got the first message," Logan said. "I thought you might have," the voice said. "I appreciate you picking up. This is a one-time conversation." "Understood." A pause. The deliberate pause of someone who had been trained to use silence as a tool. "I'll be direct then. The engagement we discussed involves a matter in Southeast Asia. 8 days. Your profile is specific to what's needed. The team would be drawn from people with your operational background, though not from your previous unit. What's the target? A network involved in supply chain exploitation that has recently expanded into territory with significant humanitarian implications. The kind of thing that tends not to get addressed through official channels. Logan stood at his office window. The city was doing its mid-morning thing, commerce, motion, the ordinary infrastructure of people going about their lives. From 32 floors up, it had a particular quality of distance, not cold, just elevated, the way looking at something from above changes your relationship to it without changing the thing itself. "Who sanctioned this?" he said. "I'm not in a position to—" "Who sanctioned it?" Logan said again. Not louder, just with the quality of someone who had asked a question and was indicating that a non-answer was itself information. A pause. "The authorization is lateral, not official channel." Meaning unofficial. Meaning someone who used to have authority still thinks they have it. He said it without heat. "I've been in that room. I know what lateral authorization means." He paused. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it and pass it along accurately because this is the only time I'll say it." The voice was quiet. "I left a unit 3 years ago because I was ordered to execute a mission that would have killed people who had nothing to do with what we were there for. I refused that order. Everything I built up to that point went away because of it, and I've made a different life in the time since. And that life is not available for 8-day engagements that are authorized by people who think lateral is a synonym for legal." He paused. "I have a daughter. I have a job I'm doing. I have a team that's depending on the work we're building together. None of those things are theoretical. They're what's actually real." Another pause. Briefer. "I'm not the person you're looking for. I haven't been for 3 years. I'd appreciate it if your organization updated whatever file has my name in it." Silence on the line. "Then, the network we're discussing is responsible for—" "I don't doubt it," Logan said. "I don't doubt there's a real problem. There usually is. That's how this works. There's always a real problem, and the real problem is always the reason why the other questions don't need to be asked." He looked at the city. "The answer is no." He ended the call. He stood at the window for a moment. His hands were steady. His breathing was regular. There was no surge of the old adrenaline, no pull of the identity that had once been the whole of who he was. What he felt instead was something closer to, not relief exactly, because relief implied he'd been holding on. More like clarity. The specific clarity that comes from saying a true thing out loud and finding that it is, actually and completely, true. He sat back down. He picked up the vendor contract and read the paragraph he'd been stuck on, and this time it was clear, and he made his note in the margin, and the morning continued. Peps. He told Avery about it that afternoon, not because he was required to. It wasn't a security matter that fell under his professional responsibilities, or at least it was marginal enough that he could have reasonably not reported it. He told her because he'd decided, somewhere in the last 3 years of building a life that didn't rely on strategic silence, that the people who deserved to be in the room with the whole truth were the people who'd earned it. And Avery, in the space of a few months, had earned it. She listened without interrupting, which he'd noticed was a quality she had that many people who operated at her level didn't, the ability to actually let information arrive before responding to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you in any danger?" she said. First thing, straight to what mattered. "No. This kind of organization doesn't apply pressure that way. It's not how they operate." He paused. "They'll move on to the next name on the list." "You sound certain about that." "I am." She nodded slowly. Her hands were folded on the desk in a way that meant she was thinking, not performing composure, but actually using it as a tool to think with. "The Morrow incident," she said carefully. "The one you mentioned in your office. Was this related?" "Different organization. Adjacent world." He looked at her steadily. "It's a larger ecosystem than people realize. I'm not going to be able to fully explain it to you in a way that's complete, because some of it I can't explain and some of it you don't need. What I can tell you is that I've been outside of it for 3 years and the call was recruitment, not threat. And you declined. Without ambiguity." She held his gaze. "Why are you telling me this?" He thought about how to answer that. Not the evasive version, not the professional version, but the actual answer. Because if the same number calls the Nexarian main line, or if someone makes an inquiry about my employment, or if anything in that world touches this building, which I don't expect but which is not impossible, you should know the context." He paused. "And because you've been straight with me since the beginning, and that deserves the same thing back." Avery was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the afternoon was doing its slow shift toward evening, the light going from white to gold. He'd been watching this building's light for nearly a year now, first from the ground level, the marble floor view of it, and now from here. And the light was the same light, but the view was different, and both were real. "Thank you," she said, simply, without the professional frame around it. Just two words that meant what they said. He nodded. "Logan." She said his name with the careful quality of someone moving into different territory. "Whatever happened in that unit, the mission, the decision you made, I want you to know that I don't have any uncertainty about who you are because of it. None." She paused. "I know what it costs to refuse a direct order in that context. I know what it costs to be the person who says this is wrong when everyone around you is prepared to proceed. I don't know the specifics, and I don't need them." A pause. "What you did took something most people don't have." He looked at her. Something in the back of his throat tightened briefly and then released. "It cost me a lot," he said. Honestly, without self-pity. "I know it did. I'd do it again." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "That's exactly my point." They sat in the quiet of the late afternoon, in the office that had gradually become more his over the past weeks. The wrong-sized desk finally replaced with one that fit, the 2 boxes of Garrett's cleared out, a small drawing of Emma's parking garage taped to the inside of the top drawer where Logan could see it when he opened it and nobody else could, unless they were looking for it. The city moved outside the window. The light continued its slow work. Something was happening between them that neither of them was in a position to name yet, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it because it was too new and too important to rush, and because both of them were, in their different ways, people who understood the value of waiting until the ground was solid before putting weight on it. "The Voss investigation," Logan said, moving them back to something they could stand on. "Board meeting is next week?" "Thursday," she said. Her professional manner reasserted itself, but the warmth that had come through in the last few minutes didn't entirely leave. It sat underneath the precision, visible if you knew where to look. "Legal thinks we have a clean position given the predating, but the board is going to want a cultural accountability narrative, and I need to have something real to offer, not just a policy document." "Use the wheel," he said. She blinked. "Explain." "The mop bucket. 4 maintenance requests, 2 months, nothing happened. That's the story of Voss in miniature, a culture where the people responsible for making things work were the last ones whose needs were addressed, and the reason nobody noticed was that Voss and people like him were the ones controlling what got noticed." He paused. "Tell them what that costs. Not just in fraud numbers. In the people who were in that building doing their jobs correctly and getting nothing for it. The culture that enabled Voss is the same culture that let a maintenance request sit for 2 months. Fix both, and you've fixed something real." Avery looked at him. The thinking expression had shifted into something that was still processing but had also arrived somewhere. "That's a better frame than anything legal has given me. It's the accurate frame." "You keep saying that, because accurate and useful are usually the same thing." He paused. "Usually." She nodded slowly, and he could see her assembling the presentation in her head. She was the kind of person who thought in complete structures, not fragments. "I'll use it," she said. "And Logan," she stopped. "Yeah. I'm glad the wheel is fixed." He looked at her for a moment. "So am I," he said. Spring came to the city the way it always did. Tentatively at first, cold mornings with warm afternoons, the light lasting a little longer each day, something loosening in the way people walked and the way the streets sounded. Logan noticed it in the small ways that you notice seasons when you spend a significant part of your life outdoors or near windows, in the quality of light on the marble on the ground floor when he passed through the lobby in the mornings, in the way Emma's school drop-offs were starting to require one fewer layer. His life had settled into something that resembled its new shape. Not finished. Life didn't finish settling into shapes. It just found a current shape, which held until the next thing changed it, but stable in the ways that mattered. The security team was functioning at a level it hadn't before, and Kovac had grown into the deputy role with the specific growth of someone who'd needed responsibility to find out what they were capable of. The vendor contracts had been renegotiated, and the regional offices were operating under protocols that Logan could verify rather than accept on paperwork. The Torres client had renewed their contract after the follow-up call Logan's team had provided, and word of it had moved in the right direction through Nexarian's client network. He was, in the language of the professional world, doing well. He thought about that sometimes. The distance between doing well and being well, and whether the gap between them was closing or whether it just looked like it was closing from the inside. He'd spent a long time in the gap, doing the necessary surface work of a functional life, while something deeper was still in the process of repair. That was not a complaint. That was just the honest topology of recovery, which wasn't a line and wasn't a story with a clean arc. It was more like living in a house while fixing it, room by room. Some rooms almost done, and some rooms you still stepped carefully in. He thought about Morrow less than he used to. That was real progress, and he didn't diminish it by calling it anything more than what it was, a reduction in the frequency of something that had once been constant. The event itself had not changed. His culpability, which was not legal culpability, but the other kind, the one you assigned yourself, had not changed. The civilians who had been hurt in a mission that proceeded without him because someone had filled his position with someone willing to follow the order. They were still hurt, that was still real, and he still carried it. He just carried it differently now, less like something strapped to his back and more like something in his pocket. Present, its weight known, not the organizing principle of everything he did. He wasn't sure he'd ever completely put it down. He wasn't sure that was possible, or even the right goal. Some weights deserved to be carried. The question was whether the carrying broke you or made you more careful about what you put down and what you didn't. He'd chosen careful. General Holt called in April, this time from his own number, which Logan had, and with an opening that was more personal than operational, asking after Emma first, which Logan noted, and then asking how the job was going with the specific curiosity of someone who had made a referral and was genuinely interested in whether it had been the right one. Logan told him the broad strokes, the team, the protocols, the vendor situation. And Sinclair, Holt said, she runs a tight operation, Logan said, better than she gives herself credit for. That's a consistent character trait in people worth working for, Holt said. The overestimators tend to make worse decisions. A pause. She called me after everything, sent a note to my physician too, checked in on the head. She's thorough. She is. Another pause. I hear the Voss matter went in front of the board. Last week, the accountability framework passed. Avery presented it. I heard it went well. It went accurately, Logan said, which made it go well. Holt made a sound that might have been a laugh. You're sounding better than the last time I talked to you. Logan thought about that. He was standing in his office, the afternoon light doing what it did at this hour, hitting the west face of the building across the street and bouncing back in a warm second-hand glow that wasn't direct sunlight but was the next best thing. I think I am, he said. Mostly. Mostly is honest. I try to be. I know you do. The old man paused. The call came, didn't it? The other call. Logan was quiet for a moment. He wasn't surprised that Holt knew. The general moved in a world where information moved, and Logan had closed one door, but doors in that world had a way of being audible. It came, he said. And? I told them to update their file. Holt was quiet for a moment, then, good. He said it simply, the single word carrying the weight of someone who had given that answer himself, at some point, in some version of the same conversation. That's the right answer. I know it is. It won't be the last call, Holt said. You know that. I know it. I also know what the answer is, so the number of calls doesn't change much. No, Holt said. I suppose it doesn't. A pause. You did a hard thing, Logan. A long time ago, and then again recently, in the same week you decided to do something different with your life. That takes a kind of character that doesn't get mentioned much in the documentation. The documentation on me is limited, Logan said dryly. By design. as we've discussed. The general's voice had the warmth in it that came through occasionally. Not often, not performed, but real when it appeared. Look after that girl, and the job, and whatever else is taking shape up there. Logan thought about Avery's coffee cup on his desk, and the near smile and the conversation about her niece's birthday. He thought about it with the particular care of someone who was not going to rush a thing that deserved to not be rushed. "I'm looking after it," he said. "I know you are," Holt said. "That's the thing about you, Pierce. You always were." Set. Emma turned 9 in May. Logan made the kind of birthday she'd specified, which was specific and non-negotiable, and included a particular type of cake that required him to watch a tutorial 3 times before he understood the frosting technique. The cake was imperfect in ways that were visible and didn't matter. Emma examined it with the careful appreciation of someone who understood the difference between effort and result and knew which one counted more. Patrice came over with a gift. Ben from work had sent Emma a card, which Emma found interesting because she had never met Ben, but Logan had apparently mentioned her enough that Ben felt she warranted a card, a fact that Emma filed with the archive of things she found telling about her father's workplace life. Logan watched his daughter sit at their kitchen table in the apartment they'd been in for 3 years, eating imperfect cake and talking to Patrice about the 4th level of the parking garage, which had been structurally completed and was currently being debated for expansion into a 5th level. The apartment had accumulated the particular texture of a lived-in place. Emma's drawings and frames, a stack of books on the coffee table that were in various states of being read, a hook by the door with Logan's jacket on it, and beside the door the boots. He looked at the boots from across the room. They were still there. Still the same worn leather, still the same heavy construction, still carrying in their surface the particular biography of everywhere they'd been. He'd worn them to career day, which had been the right choice. He hadn't worn them to the board presentation, where he'd worn actual business shoes because the context demanded it, and he was old enough to understand when context had a legitimate claim on you. He wore them on weekends. He wore them when he needed to remember something, without quite articulating to himself what it was he was remembering. He thought he'd keep wearing them for a long time. They weren't about the past, exactly. He'd spent enough time in them in the present that they'd become about both. The person he'd been, and the person he was building. The weight of what had been lost, and the specific daily work of what was being rebuilt. You didn't have to choose one reading over the other. The boots held both. Emma looked over from the table and caught him looking at the boots and gave him the expression she gave when she caught him in a moment of being inward. "You're thinking," she said. "I'm allowed." "You could also have more cake." Both options are available," he agreed. He got up and had more cake, and Patrice told a story about her nephew that made Emma laugh, and the apartment was warm and a little loud and imperfect in all the ways that made it real. The last thing Logan did on the last Friday of May was stay late at the office. Not because of a crisis, not because of an emergency or a board presentation or a client call that ran over. He stayed because there was a piece of protocol documentation he wanted to finish, the crisis response manual he'd been building since his 3rd week. The comprehensive version that would allow the team to function fully even if Logan himself was unavailable, which was the mark of a system that was actually working and not just dependent on one person's knowledge. He was on the last section when he heard a knock on his open door. Avery was standing in the doorway in her coat, which meant she was leaving, and she had her bag over one shoulder and the Friday evening version of her face, less controlled than the Monday version. The week's work showing slightly at the edges in a way that was not weakness but humanity. He'd come to look forward to that face. He wasn't sure she knew he did. "Working late?" she said. "Finishing something." She looked at the document on his desk. "The crisis manual?" "Last section." She leaned against the doorframe. "You know you don't have to finish it tonight." "I know, I want to." She looked at him with the genuine qualities she'd been allowing more of, in increments over the past months. Not the CEO face or the professional face, or the face that had learned early in life to keep certain things behind glass. The other one, the one that had looked at him in the service corridor and asked if he'd turned the buffer down because of her. The one that had come to his office on a Friday with 2 cups of coffee. "Have dinner with me," she said. He looked up. She said it directly, which was the only way she knew how to say anything that mattered, and she said it without the professional frame around it, which meant she'd decided to say the true thing and was doing it the same way he tried to, straight and without managing the outcome in advance. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the ground needing to be solid before you put weight on it. He thought about the months of careful distance and the incremental honesty and the near smiles and the coffee and the way she'd said, "I'm glad the wheel is fixed." He thought about Emma, who was at Patrice's tonight, who had given him her analysis of Avery after the one time they'd briefly met in the lobby. "She looks like she thinks fast," Emma had said, which was both accurate and, from Emma, high praise. He thought about a life that had been built from almost nothing, room by room, in a house he'd been living in while fixing it. Some rooms were ready. "Give me 10 minutes to finish the section," he said. Avery smiled. The full version this time, not the almost. It changed her face the way it always did, opened something that was usually held. And it was real. And it was for him, and he held it in his peripheral vision while he turned back to the document and finished what he'd started. 10 minutes. He'd said 10 minutes. He finished in 9. They went to a restaurant that neither of them had been to before, which felt right, not somewhere that belonged to either of their routines, but a new place, neutral ground, the kind of dinner that was starting rather than continuing. The food was good in an unshowy way. The conversation moved in the way that conversation moves between two people who have already said hard things to each other and no longer need to warm up. It went directly to the real things, and stayed there, and occasionally detoured into the lighter things that real relationships need as much as the serious ones. She told him about her mother, the woman in the photograph, who had worked 2 jobs for years and never once suggested to her daughter that ambition was too much to carry. He told her about Emma's mother, gone when Emma was 4, not dramatically, just gone. A relationship that had not survived the weight of what Logan had been carrying at the time. He said it without self-justification, because there wasn't any available that was accurate, and because Avery was the kind of person who would have seen through the self-justification anyway. She told him about the board, about the specific loneliness of being the youngest person in every room of power she'd entered, about the years of making herself unassailable because assailable had never felt like an option. He told her about the years after Morrow, the warehouse job, the long months of finding out who he was when everything he'd been built to do was gone. They talked like that for 2 hours, over food and then coffee, and when they walked out into the May evening, the city was doing what cities do on warm spring nights, filling up, lights on, people moving through it with the particular ease of a night that felt like something beginning. She stopped on the sidewalk outside. "I should say," she started. "Don't qualify it," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever you were going to say to manage expectations or set parameters, don't." He said it gently. "We've both been careful for a long time. We can afford to just let this be what it is." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, the small nod of someone who had been given permission they didn't know they needed. "Okay," she said. "Good." They stood on the sidewalk in the warm evening, and the city moved around them the way it always did, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, and that was all right. Silence between two people who have nothing to prove and nothing to manage is one of the rarer things, and both of them knew enough to recognize it without making a speech about it. He walked her to her car. They said goodnight the way people say goodnight when what they mean is something that doesn't require translation, simply with the warmth of something that was real and had room to grow and didn't need to be rushed. On the drive home, Logan thought about a lot of things in the gentle, unfocused way of a mind that had finished its work for the day and was just existing in the aftermath of a good evening. He thought about Emma and her parking garage and the 3rd level and the 4th and the 5th level she was currently considering, and the way she made decisions about load-bearing capacity with the confidence of an engineer who had done her calculations and was prepared to defend them. He thought about Kovacs finishing the monitoring protocol, about Torres renewing the contract, about Terrence's nod in the lobby and Ben's card in the mail, and Brielle adding him to a contact list he'd never quite left. He thought about a mop bucket wheel, fixed, 4 requests over 2 months, and then 1 call, and then fixed. He thought about boots. He thought about Morrow, briefly, and felt it where he always felt it. Not gone, not safe to call resolved, but carried rather than carrying him, which was the difference that had taken 3 years to learn. He thought about a man who had lost everything by doing the right thing, and built something else instead, and found out that something else was, in its imperfect and specific and daily way, what a life was actually for. He pulled up to the apartment building and sat in the car for a moment in the quiet. He'd known, when they handed him the mop and showed him the supply closet, that the floor was temporary. Not in the sense that he'd been waiting for rescue. He hadn't been, and the distinction mattered. Temporary because nothing is permanent, because people move through phases and phases have their own necessary work. And the work of that phase had been to survive and to care for Emma and to learn how to be a person in a small life without needing the large one to feel like yourself. He'd learned that. And the work of this phase was something else. Something he was still discovering, room by room, in the house that was still being built and would keep being built, because that was the nature of things that were actually alive. He got out of the car. He walked up to the apartment, took off his jacket, hung it on the hook by the door. The apartment was quiet with Emma at Patrice's. He looked at the boots beside the door, same as always, worn and specific and entirely his. He left them there. There was nobody he needed to be tonight, except the person who lived in this apartment and was loved by a 9-year-old who gave 3 weeks' notice and built ambitious things out of cardboard and told him, in her own language, every single day that he had gotten enough things right. The city moved outside the window. Logan Pierce went to bed. And for the first time in a long time, that was everything.